Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining for today's Tech Talk conducted by the ACRM Technology Networking Group. If you're not a member of the Technology Networking Group and would like to join, please visit the website provided on the slide. I'll also add this website in the chat in a minute. You can also contact the chair, Rachel Profit, or the chair-elect, Lauren Sheehan. My name is Shatanaka Bhattacharya, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Communications Task Force within the Technology Networking Group at ACRM. Our speaker today is Angella Smalley, and I'm trying to, is Angella Smalley, Dr. Angella Smalley from Simbex. Before we get started with the presentation, I do want to advise that this meeting is being recorded. I'd like to ask all attendees to keep your phones and mics muted and keep your cameras turned off throughout the presentation. We do expect to have about 15 to 20 minutes available for discussion at the end of the webinar. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat feature, or we will address as many of those as possible during the latter part of the hour. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Angella Smalley. I am going to pause for just a second and stop sharing while Dr. Smalley starts sharing her screen while I introduce her. Dr. Smalley leads the commercialization services arm of Simbex, a medical device and consumer health product design and development firm in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Her role involves providing guidance and strategic consulting to medtech innovators who are in the process of bringing their product to market. She specializes in assessing the product viability from the perspective of care pathway, clinical workflow, and reimbursement considerations. She also provides expertise in literature review and market assessment to understand the opportunity landscape in the context of larger medical ecosystem. Her work at Simbex has included involvement in the NIH-funded Driven Accelerator Hub and the NIH-funded Center for Translation of Rehabilitation Engineering Advances and Technology, TREAT. She serves as the member of the Board of Directors for the Board of Certification and Accreditation International. Her past career includes clinical experience in a variety of rehabilitation settings and a PhD in rehabilitation science. Please use the chat feature to ask questions. We will answer as many questions again at the conclusion of the presentation. Dr. Smalley, thank you for being here. I will hand over the presentation to you.
Thank you very much. One of the things Shatanaka didn't say is that we both went to the University of Buffalo at the same time. So we were classmates, and it's really nice to be able to see each other in rehab again out here in the professional world. So our topic today is forming a commercialization strategy. And here's the plan, here's the outline for the talk. First, I'm going to give you a little intro, a little background about me. We're going to talk about commercialization and what it means. And then we're going to talk about strategy and what we mean by that. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time left over for a Q&A session. So first of all, my background, this little kind of squiggle graphic up at the top represents pretty well how I got here. I was basically like a baby, a child, and then a student forever. And then I bounced around to various aspects of rehab science in my early career. I was in sports medicine, thought I might want to be a physical therapist for a while, worked in orthotics and prosthetics for about 6 years, did biomechanics research as part of my PhD. And now I'm a consultant, and I thankfully get to combine all of these interests in my current career, which is really great. So I work for a company called Simbex, and Simbex is a medical device design and development company. And about 3/4 of our company are engineering focused. We have a lot of people with technical skills and software and electrical and mechanical engineering, and they actually can help build the mechanical aspects of the medical devices themselves. But I lead a smaller team that's called the Commercialization Strategy Team. And we are actually specifically not engineers because it's our job to look at everything else except the technology. that goes into the success of a product. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I think that'll kind of give you a flavor of the type of work that I usually do. You may not have heard of Simbex before, but you may have heard of some of the grants, and Satanika also mentioned these. A lot of the commercialization strategy background information that we have has come from working with a large number of startup companies through the various federally funded programs that we've had. And by doing so, we got to see, literally hundreds of innovators come through, and a lot of commonalities started to occur through that feedback process. And we're able to take those findings now and help apply them to other folks who come to us for consulting services or educational services. And we can hopefully provide a little boost to those folks, given all the wisdom that we were able to collect through the federally funded programs. I wanted to give just kind of one example of the type of work that we do, because this can kind of give you a little background and flavor of the type of people who come through. So this project is called Opus One, and a clinician who worked in orthotics and prosthetics came to us and said that he had a great idea for a product, but he hadn't built it at all. He just kind of had what we call a napkin sketch about it. And we talked him through his initial idea. We helped build a prototype and do some initial testing. We looked at the business model for if this product would work or not. And then he's actually going to be launching his product out into the market next month. So it's really exciting to see the whole commercialization journey that has happened, all kind of under our assistance. This product is an adhesive sensor, and it sticks onto an orthotic or prosthetic device. And it has a little movement detecting chip inside of it. And with that movement detector, the things that we're measuring are how much the patient is wearing their device and how much they're walking while they're wearing their device. And to this point, there was no way of knowing that about a patient who had gotten an orthotic or prosthetic device. So we just had sort of always been assuming that the patients were wearing them. And then when the patients would come back into the clinic, you'd be able to check if there was a lot of wear and tear on their device. There was no kind of quantitative measure. So this is really an interesting step forward in rehab, especially in the orthotics and prosthetics space. And it'll be very cool to see how the rest of his commercialization journey goes. Okay, let's talk about commercialization broadly and then get into the strategy component secondarily. I think this may be more sensitive to this than most people because I use this word all the time in my professional life, but the term commercialization can sometimes be so broad that it kind of loses all meaning. It often can be used as like a big bucket term. And so let's think about it more as a process than a description. So I think commercialization should be defined as the process of getting an innovation from your mind to the people who need it. And I really like the analogy that's shown here in these images. So this is not my image. This is actually from Georgia Tech, and it's from an article that was published a couple of years ago by them. But what they did was use the analogy of launching a medical product kind of being like a space mission. So on this first panel to the left, they're talking about the amount of time it takes to prepare for this type of mission. And they say, it takes several years to prepare for a rocket journey to the moon or to Mars or wherever you're going. And it actually takes about 10 to 20 years to get a medical product to the market from the lab. So there's a good analogy there. Also, space travel is notoriously expensive, right? We're talking billions of dollars. And that's not an unheard of amount of money if you're trying to launch a complicated product, maybe like a pharmaceutical product. $1 billion might go into that launch process. If you're trying to launch something more simple and limited, like a low risk medical device, then you might be talking more like $1 million instead of $1 billion, but it's still a lot of money. And then thirdly, there's a whole lot of ways that it can go wrong. So there's a tangle of requirements to meet. There's a lot of dead ends you could get stuck down. There's a lot of room and opportunity for failure in both launching a product and launching a mission to space. So I think this triptych is a really nice mental image of the commercialization journey, and that it's difficult, but also that it's rewarding and exciting. One of the conversations that I try to always have with folks when we're talking about what their commercialization journey will look like is what their goals are. And I think this is very important. Before you set off on your journey, you want to know where you're going. The very first thing that I ask them is, how will you know if this is a success? So if you were writing a book about your life and you were able to write the end of that book, what would be the end? They lived happily ever after. What would that look like, you know? Do you want inventor of this commonly used technology to be one of the things that is written about you someday? Or are you looking to make a smaller splash? Or do you have 10 or 12 patients in your local clinic that you want to be able to use this product with? And just being able to scope and guide the process from those types of questions is very helpful. Sometimes the career goals and the personal goals of the innovator get a little bit swamped and lost when you're thinking about the business goals of maybe the investors who might eventually be involved in the commercialization of a product. So I think it's important to document them, write them down, and if it's a multi-person commercialization team, make sure that everybody on the team knows what the goals of the other people on the team are so that they can work together to make sure that as many of those goals happen as possible. This diagram shows kind of the typical steps of a commercialization journey, starting from a corporate or institutional setting. So let's say that you are a researcher at a university and your job is to do research and development. Maybe one day you're talking with a grad student in your lab and together you guys have a great idea for a product. You have a light bulb moment, right? Well, since you work for that university and they sort of own your time and your resources while you're there, they actually have a right to your invention. So you have to disclose to them that you have an invention and then discuss with them if they want to file for intellectual property to protect this idea. Maybe they want to think about the patent process for this idea. So that costs a little bit of money. So they'll usually do an initial evaluation to see if they think it's worthwhile. And then if they decide that it is worthwhile, then they may file for a provisional patent and get you started on the intellectual property journey. At this point, you're still within the institution. You may decide that you want to get a couple of extra grants. Maybe you want to test your idea further. So you'll do some proof of concept testing. At some point, though, you have to stop doing those experiments and make a decision of whether or not you think you want to take a leap on this idea. And that leap is a little bit like the launch to outer space. You're leaving your comfort zone and you're getting out into the wilds of industry. You'll notice that this kind of leap from the institution to industry also lines up with this grim reminder that there's a valley of death here. So a lot of ideas don't successfully make that jump. That's because this is where things get complicated. You have to set up a business, you have to come up with a business strategy, you have to know what your competitors are doing, you have to decide how you're going to sell your product and what exactly it is that you're selling. But let's say that you successfully set up that business model and you make your first initial sales of your product. So you've now reached a successful new product. You're on the market, people are using your product, they're liking it or not liking it as the case may be, but they're talking about it. Let's say that you reach the next jump, which is that your business is becoming a success. So you're making enough sales that the volume is able to float the business. Now you can begin to grow as a company to the point where you can make whatever impact you wanted to make in the field. So as you can see, there's a whole lot of hurdles and stage gates along the way, but from where that idea was conceived to where it finally makes an impact. And throughout that process, one of the things that we've found is that keeping a balanced perspective is very key to success. What I mean by that is everybody has the tendency to default to their comfort zone. So if you're someone who comes from a clinical perspective, then you might look at your idea from this tunnel vision of a clinician. If you're someone that comes from a business perspective, you might only be interested in the business model around this idea. And the same thing from a technical perspective. But really, for an idea to successfully get off the launch pad and into the market, it really needs to be sound on all three principles. And the best way to accomplish this is to put aside your personal biases and sort of take your idea, move it out away from yourself and walk around it from all directions and look at it from all three of these perspectives. Oftentimes innovators are connected to their idea, it's their baby. And so they really have trouble with this process. And so they may have to get in a team of advisors, maybe that have the expertise of these three perspectives. But let's say that you get past that initial hurdle, you decide that you are going to move forward with it. You can also maintain your balance in the development process. So here's those three domains again. And one of the things that we see success is if people can keep their development process well balanced. So if you think about these as maybe progress bars, you want the progress bar for how you're developing your technical plan to be similar to how you're developing your business plan and your clinical plan. What we see very often is that people allow one of these bars to really run away while the other ones are underdeveloped. And this is probably the configuration that we see come through the doors most frequently. So someone has spent years and many dollars developing a relatively mature prototype of their concept before they've really spent any time or resources thinking about the business or the clinical aspect of their product. And just by looking at this visually, you can see that there's imbalance here, and that imbalance introduces risk. It could be that you wasted a lot of that time and resources because of something from one of these other domains that had you had a more well-rounded perspective, you could have built into the product from the very beginning. One of the ways to ensure that you are keeping this well-rounded perspective is to ask yourself difficult questions on a regular basis from each of those perspectives. So I have three examples here. From the technological perspective, if you're an early company, one of the very first things that you have to be able to describe is what are your minimal viable product requirements. And what I mean by that is, if you were to take your grand idea and you were to distill it down to its essence, to the most simple version of your idea, what would have to be included in that product? It may be that you have a whole bunch of features that you would like to see eventually included in your product, but they are not the things that are central to the definition. So an example that gets used a lot with the concept of minimal viable product is to think about a form of personal transport. So you could think about a car, and you could choose between building something like a Lamborghini that's very expensive and very high end, or maybe if your whole goal is just to transport that person, maybe you actually need to build a skateboard, something that's very, very simple in order to test and see if people actually want a form of personal transportation in their lives. That's a silly example because we all want some type of transportation, which is why we all have some type of vehicle or skateboard or bike or something to get us around from point A to point B. But you can take that same concept and apply it to whatever product you're thinking about building. It's not guaranteed that people want the thing that you're making. And so building the simplest version in order to test it is a great way to start. Remember that saying that says that the perfect is the enemy of the good? That's really what we're talking about here when we're talking about minimal viable product. You want something that's good enough to get your point across and to test initially. And then if that test is a success, then you can build, the Lamborghini later on. From a business perspective, this is kind of the most fundamental set of questions that you need to be able to answer. The first one is, who is going to buy this thing? And the second one is, how much are they going to pay for it? And notice I didn't say who is going to use this thing. Very often in healthcare, and especially in rehab, the person who buys it and the person who uses it might be two different folks. So for example, if you're building something that is going to be used as a piece of equipment in a physical therapy practice, the clinic manager might buy that thing. Whoever buys the supplies and restocks the equipment in that facility might be the one who actually writes the check for it. And you're designing it for the users, who are the patients and the clinicians, but they may not be the people making the purchasing decision. So you really need to know the difference and the distinction there, because you now not only have to win over the folks who are going to use this product, but also those who are going to write the check. The last thing, which is from the clinical perspective, that's really important to understand as an early stage company, is to ask yourself, what is the current standard of care? And this means, what are they doing right now without your product on the market? And I mean in detail. Why are they doing it? What are the options that they choose from right now? Where did the recommendation for that standard of care come from? Who was the professional organization that made that recommendation? And what type of research and literature review did they do before they made that professional recommendation that got adopted as standard care? The reason you're getting to know all of that stuff is because this is the inertia that you're going to have to overcome when you introduce your new product to the market. You have to understand, is it decent what they're working with right now, or is there a huge gap between what you can offer and what they're currently using? Let's say you have a product that is more advanced and a little further down the line. Here's another 3 example questions that you could ask yourself in order to maintain balance. The first one is, am I documenting the design history? This is a common pitfall that we see, which is that folks forget to write down how they got where they are. So if you're someone who has, 4 or 5 versions of your device or your product idea, your initial versions might be, scribbled on the back of a telephone bill that's stashed in a drawer somewhere in your house. That is not exactly the type of formal design history file that the FDA is going to be looking for when you go to, someday down the road, file for regulatory clearance. So it's much easier if you keep everything in one place and in an organized fashion so that you can actually walk someone through the history of your idea and why this initial design didn't work and what you did to change to make it more safe and effective for the future. Another question, and this one is from the business perspective, is what is the time to market? And again, I'm talking about very specific information here. A lot of times you'll have innovators who will give you a broad answer and they'll say, I think it'll be 2 to 3 years. And then when you press them on that and say, what makes you think that? Their assumptions might be very loose. They may have a timeline that has a lot of gaps in it. So I recommend to people that they do kind of an end run. So you start from where you would love to see the launch happen, and then you work backwards to what you need to be accomplishing today. And then you ask yourself, are those milestones realistic? Am I going to hit those? And if I'm not, then how are things going to shift in the timeline? And ideally, you would be precise enough that you would have at least maybe a month that you're aiming for in a particular year. This question of what time will it get to market is one of the most commonly asked questions that you will encounter as an innovator. If people are excited about your product idea, they're going to say, great, when can I buy it? And having a good polished answer to come back to them with is really key to the success of your launch. Sometimes they don't actually want the answer. Sometimes they just want to know that you have a plan to get the answer. So if you've done that timelining exercise and you can explain to them, all the variables that are going to inform this process, they can feel a little bit more comforted to know that you've done the due diligence in order to project when your initial sales will occur. And then the third question for more advanced folks, and this is from the clinical perspective, is what is your regulatory and reimbursement strategy? And what I mean by this question is your product going to be regulated by the FDA, or is this going to be a consumer health product? And then secondarily, if you are going to have a medical product on your hands, is it going to be paid for by the patient's insurance? And are you sure it's going to be paid for by their insurance? Because it's very easy to say that that's your plan, but there's some more details that have to go into that. You have to know that they actually will cover it when the physician or the therapist or whatever healthcare provider bills for their services using this product. There's probably a whole nother presentation in each one of these questions that we could go into detail, but this is just giving you an example of how you can use this well-rounded, this balanced perspective to ask yourself the difficult questions throughout the development process. Okay, and like we saw in that initial analogy about launching a product is kind of like launching a rocket into space. That bar panel to the right that showed the rocket zigzagging all over the place is absolutely representative of what happens in the commercialization journey. There's lots of opportunities for pivoting and slightly changing your trajectory, and that's okay. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about the things that might inform trajectory changes or pivots. And these are all things that have come from, like I said, personal observation with a large number of innovators who have come through Simbex. One of the things that people are afraid of doing is pivoting too much. So they're afraid that they won't make progress forward if they keep, this lateral thinking mindset. And I would say not to be afraid of that, because you are keeping your possibilities open. And keeping them open until you really settle on the best trajectory is a great method for moving forward. The first thing I want to address is that sometimes you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist. So if you're working really hard on your innovation, you want to be sure that you are actually solving an actual problem. This little cartoon here says this guy has created an innovative solution, but he's still looking for a problem that goes with it. If you find yourself in this kind of Cinderella situation where you have the glass slipper and you're looking for the foot that fits, the odds are against you, right? So it's much easier if you have something that is tailored directly towards its application in the clinical world. This is just kind of a wake-up call to say, if you do find yourself in this situation, just know that you're now in a high-risk situation. So it's an opportunity for you to tap the brakes and look around and say, does it make sense to keep moving forward in this direction? Or do we want to look back at our product maybe and rethink some things in order to be more tailored to an actual problem that we can observe around us? At Simbex, we use this design thinking framework for a lot of things. I think it was originally developed by Stanford. And it's a 5-step process that starts with empathizing with the people who will eventually be using your product so that you can understand what their current challenges are. And then defining how you're going to solve that problem, or what problem specifically that you're going to solve. And then thinking about ways to solve it, prototyping your solutions, and then developing a test plan to see if you actually did solve it. And then this is a cycle. So once you get to the testing process, you return back to your empathizing step, and you bring your solution in front of your stakeholders and you say, what do you think about this? What problems do you see here? And then you can repeat the cycle. The reason we like this, and the reason that we've emphasized this first step so clearly here, is because the feedback process is really key to the success of the eventual launch and commercialization of your product. Sometimes, and you would be shocked at how often this happens, an innovation is thought up by maybe 4 people in a room, and then they ask their friends and family if they thought it was a good idea. And then they maybe asked 1 or 2 other folks who lived in a 20-mile radius of them if they thought it was a good idea. And with those kind of 6 yeses, or however many people they talked to, they then went forward with hundreds of thousands of dollars and years worth of investment. That's a pretty shaky foundation to be building your whole strategy on. So what we like about this design thinking framework is that it emphasizes the importance of going out and gathering lots of stakeholder feedback. And once you've gathered it, the next emphasis should be on using it the most effective way that you can. And by recording your feedback systematically, you can go back and refer to it in the future when you may have a different question, and you can still glean additional knowledge from that feedback. The thing that's shown here on the slide is called a user empathy map. And I think when this was developed, they were thinking that people were going to record their notes, with a pencil and paper on this map. But you can do a very similar thing if you're typing something up in a Word document. You could just have headings with these section titles. But you'll notice that right in the center and the emphasis of this empathy map is discussion about the user. And that's because the empathizing process, it's very important that all of the focus is on the person you're talking to, and you're trying to get information from them more than trying to tell them and sell them on your idea. That's a really difficult, commonly fallen into trap. When someone is excited about their idea, they just like to show it to everyone and say, look at this great thing that I'm thinking of, instead of saying something like, hey, I would like to talk to you about how you're currently treating your patients with multiple sclerosis? What problems are you running into? Do you think that you could use a tool that would help you solve this particular problem? Have you ever heard of a tool that's doing the same kinds of things as your product is thinking about? What would your reaction be if you had that tool presented to you? And you're asking those types of wide open questions so that you can initiate dialogue and storytelling from that person who's on the front lines of their profession. Then recording it in this type of way allows you to go through and look at multiple interviews and see if maybe you're uncovering similar emotions in people from different groups. That really tells you that maybe you've struck gold. People feel very strongly about this no matter what their background is. Another thing that might be helpful is to be able to go through and look at the goals that all of those folks have and see if those align. And if the goals align with the value of your product, then you know you have a winner. There's some momentum that's potentially going to happen here. It also works the other way, right? You might ask these users, what problems are you encountering when you're dealing with, X and Y situation? And they may list off 12 problems that have nothing to do with the thing that you're creating. If your innovation isn't solving one of the top problems that they're having, it's not going to be a high priority for them. So I would say that's a red flag. It's a indication that you may want to pivot slightly, adjust your trajectory. Another thing that can be really helpful when you are mapping out your journey is to think at a micro level. So imagine that your product already exists and imagine a patient visit using your product. What is that going to look like? So I have one mapped out here as an example. So this starts with the patient hearing about the provider who offers this particular service. So in this case, they may hear about it through word of mouth or through referral or maybe an online directory. And then the patient comes into their first appointment and they fill out their medical history and some assessments about their functional level. And then they're made nice and comfortable. In this case, it was on a couch, but maybe it's on a treatment table. And the equipment is prepared, it's plugged in and turned on and starts to get ready to use for the patient. And then in this case, there were sensors involved. So the sensors were attached to the patient so that we could begin getting some readings from them. And the provider has to, play with some adjustments and get the settings just right for that patient. And then some data starts to come in and the provider needs to view the dashboard and start making some clinical decisions about what the treatment plan for that patient will look like. And then maybe since the patient's there, maybe they are getting their initial treatment on the same day as their evaluation. That's what was happening with this product. So we were going to have an assessment from 5 to 10 minutes and treatment occurring immediately after. So here's this person is now hooked up to another sensor in this case. After their initial treatment, they're probably going to make some additional appointments to return and have additional treatment. So what does that look like? And then how do you know when they're done being treated with your product? In this case, the entrepreneur said that the treatment process would be like peeling an onion, right? And they would take care of some big problems and then they would probably uncover some smaller problems and it would keep getting smaller and smaller until both the patient and the clinician were satisfied with the progress that the patient had made. And at that point, they would be discharged and hopefully, running and skipping away from the clinic. So this is an example of a user journey. You can use this same format for just about any type of product. And all you're doing is thinking about the typical map of care that this patient will go on. And then you use this as a tool to bounce back some feedback from other stakeholders. So you then take this map to a stakeholder and say, here's what we're thinking about doing. Do you see any red flags here? How does this strike you? And again, you're asking those same kinds of questions that I mentioned that you would talk about when you're gaining the empathy map. Another reason that this might be useful is so that the team is all on the same board. You'd be amazed at how the game of telephone can happen between the technical team and maybe the business team who are both working on the same startup. They might be describing the same thing that they're building in very different ways. So making sure that everybody has the same language to describe how this is going to be used and what the goal of a session would be can be really key to the success of the mission. Another way you can look at your product and potentially systematically plan for a change of course is to think about it in the macro perspective. So what's shown here on the slide is the natural history of disease. And it starts down here in the bottom left corner when someone is healthy. And then maybe they develop some subclinical pre-symptoms. And eventually those creep forward until the symptoms kind of cross the clinical horizon. And at this point, the person has whatever condition that they are going to be diagnosed with, and they know that they have it. Now we have three options. So from here, the patient may get a little bit worse maybe, and then get all the way better, and then they end up in recovery. Or maybe they continue to get worse, they continue to get a little bit worse, maybe show slight improvement, and then end up with a certain disability level. Or they may continue to get worse until they eventually die. And really any disease or condition out there follows this type of path. So this gives you an opportunity to think about where your product fits in this bigger disease story of this condition. Is your product one that's going to be used in this pink section down here, maybe for early diagnosis to allow for a more favorable recovery process? Or maybe your product is one that's going to be used in the clinical horizon in those initial treatment stages. If your product is one that will be used near one of these inflection points, so it's a product that could potentially change the outcome of the patient, it's very important that you be able to define how your product informs that outcome. And that helps you put a value on the product itself. So if you're trying to make claims that your product is going to maybe cause the recovery to happen a little bit quicker, then that is going to be what you're primarily trying to document in your future clinical studies. If maybe you're trying to claim that your product makes the level of disability slightly less, then that helps you to clarify, okay, this is what I need to focus on in my future clinical studies. If your product is one that says, maybe we take someone from this trajectory, this disability trajectory, and we can switch them over to the recovery trajectory, well, that's an even more powerful story. And that's a framework that you should build all of your messaging around. And you can also imagine that if that is the story of your product, you have the leeway to ask for a much higher valuation from potential customers. Speaking of value, another thing to bear in mind when you're deciding how valuable your product is how disruptive is it? How much are you going to have to change the way people are currently doing their work in order to use your product? If your answer is that your product is revolutionary or very, very different from what they're currently using, then just know you're going to have to overcome a whole lot of inertia, right? The whole healthcare system is dialed in to using its current standard of care. And if you're going to come in and wipe that standard of care right off the map, then you better have a huge amount of value that you're proposing to bring to the situation. So the example that I'm showing here is, if you're suddenly delivering medication by drone and you've eliminated pharmacies everywhere, well, there's going to be quite a few people who have a word or two to say about that. They want to make sure that you have good proof around your value proposition and that it really makes a lot of sense for this initial mechanism to be so different. If, on the other hand, you're developing something that is more iterative in nature, and it's just maybe a better mousetrap, right? A slightly improved product that people are already familiar with using, the initial value proposition doesn't have to hold quite as much weight. So an example that I have here is a smart bandage. So maybe this bandage works exactly the same way as a traditional Band-Aid, and everyone's used to already using those. But maybe you have a small thermosensor in there so you can tell if the patient develops a fever while they're wearing this Band-Aid. That's something that doesn't really change the workflow overall, doesn't shatter, the current framework, but it may cause someone to have a little early indication of their issue before they actually start feeling sick. So your value is around that kind of 2 or 3 days worth of time that you may have saved them from their complication to when they come in and get care. Very different amount of barrier and scope in these two types of projects. So you can even ask yourself, are you more like this drone project or are you more like this bandage project? And then does your messaging align with that? In rehab science, one of the things that we're constantly fighting against is that we have traditionally quite small market opportunity compared to more central medical fields. So what I mean by that is we have fewer patients who have these specific conditions sometimes, and often there's just less money changing hands in general. So the procedures that we're working on might not be as expensive or as lucrative for the healthcare system as, say, like a cancer patient or a cardiovascular patient. So sometimes our market opportunity can be quite tiny. If you're calculating your market opportunity, the way you're doing that is you're trying to decide how many people you can sell to, and then you're multiplying that by the cost of your product. And those two things together kind of tell you how much money you could possibly make with this thing. If you do that multiplication and it ends up that you have something that might make you a couple million of dollars if you sell to everyone in your market segment, again, it's a word of caution, because the development process can very easily creep into that $1 million range. And if you are thinking that you are, the top of your market, if you get everybody in your market, you're maybe going to make $50 million. Just dial back your enthusiasm, because it takes a little while to get everyone in the market on board with a new idea. And so for the first few years, you may only have 2% of that market. And then when you do that math again, you might be dangerously close to your R&D budget. It's just something to keep in mind. One of the ways to help bridge that gap, especially for those of us in these little niche markets, is to look for ways to do your R&D without going into debt. So using grant funding is a great mechanism that allows you to begin that process. Some innovators have told me that it's a bit difficult to find grants around commercializing a product. And that's probably just because they're looking in the research grant pile instead of in the commercialization grant pile. So NIH lately has been very interested in having products get all the way to market, because they've recognized that they fund a lot of basic science, and then some of that basic science just stays in the lab and never actually makes it to the market. So they're trying to balance out their investments a little bit more. One of the initiatives that they have started is called the SEED office. And you can actually go on the NIH SEED website very easily. There's a lot of resources there for people from a research perspective getting into industry, and it's all around science and med tech. So I would highly recommend going there to look around for funding and other types of resources that might help you on your commercialization journey. Okay, I wanted to end on kind of a strange note here, and this is the note of starting over. As you saw on one of our initial slides, there is this thing called the Valley of Death, where ideas don't make it out into industry very successfully. And it happens fairly often. And I want everybody to sort of understand and accept that that's okay. And you'll always get the opportunity to start again. Probably during your exploration, during your initial commercialization journey, you probably observed some things that might have looked kind of like this. So there might have been infrastructure trying to point somebody in a different direction, and then you saw everyone circumventing that. And that's because their current problems were not being solved by the tools that they had. When you observe something like this, like a desire path of someone going around the system, that's an opportunity for a product. And I bet during your commercialization journey, you observe 2 or 3 of these. So every time you go out and interact with stakeholders and think about that design framework, you have the possibility for a new innovation to come into your mind. If you are going to be kind of a serial innovator and you want to have a lot of these ideas and see if they're going to work, one of the things that you can do for yourself is to move your diligence process forward in the commercialization timeline. So here, where you're still in kind of the protective zone of your institution, You can do your initial business strategy and your competitive assessment early on while you're still in this proof of concept phase. And then you don't try to make this jump into industry unless you're sure that your idea is strong enough. And what you've essentially done there is think through in a balanced perspective any obstacles that you might encounter and build yourself a bridge sort of over this valley of death. If it looks like it's going to be viable, not just from the technical perspective, but from the business perspective and from the clinical perspective, then you can be much more confident moving forward in the later stages of commercialization. The very last thought that I want to leave you with is that if you speed up this trial and error process, it means that you can have more of those cycles, which means that your eventual success rate will be higher. Think about it like baseball, where there's lots of strikes before there's a great home run. That happens with everyone. And so it could be that your current idea is a strike, and that's fine. Your next idea might not be. This is my contact information. You can feel free to reach out and contact me if you have any questions beyond what we covered today in the webinar. And then I will move to our Q&A section. So anyone with questions, I think we're a small enough group. You can feel free to just unmute and turn your camera on and ask your question.
Hi, Angela. Great talk. Thanks so much for that. This is John.
Hi, John.
So I have a quick question. You had mentioned about made that important distinction between sort of who's buying your product versus who is, using your product. And I just want to ask you to sort of expand on, what you mean by the users. So the users in sort of a rehab technology solution could be several different types of people, clinicians, patients, caregivers, on down the line. I just wanted to sort of open up that opportunity for you to sort of expand on sort of designing for multiple sort of user types for the same product. Perhaps?
Yeah, good question. Thank you, John. We usually say that you have to highlight the decision makers within that group. So although there might be many folks who actually touch and use your product, the people who make the decision of which product will be used should be really high on your priority list for who you're tailoring your outreach to. And so thinking about getting the initial check for the product is only half the battle, because the word of mouth and the success of folks using your product out in the real world is really what determines if you have a lasting impact with that product. So your initial user may be a clinician for a short period of time, and then maybe a patient out in the community. So I'm thinking about something like, let's use a really simple example, like a walker. So, this patient might be fit with that walker while they're in the clinic. And then the clinician may have some opinions about this style of walker versus that style of walker. And that may kind of determine which walker they hand to the patient. But the actual user journey of using that walker day in and day out will be the patient's experience. So I think defining who is the user for what period of time can really help along that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question. It's Henry. Can you share some examples of best-in-class companies or products or brands that have come to market that after their launch and their success, you look back and you say, you know what, everything was flawless?
Mm-hmm.
And do we know that information relative to that product coming to market? Because, maybe the company doesn't show all its warts in terms of, the journey that they took to get to market. But to share at least with us a leading example of best in class.
Yeah. I think you're right that a lot of times the early failures just don't rise to the attention of the industry. So you don't get to see those. And they often work the kinks out of their business plan before they actually kind of capture the field. So I'm not sure that I can give you any examples of flawed products that got themselves ironed out, but from the eventual success rate category, one that comes to mind is Hinge Health. So this is one that people in rehab science are pretty familiar with. This is a digital virtual physical therapy platform, which at the time when it came out was one of the few of its kind. And it uses some motion sensors and a tablet to walk people through physical therapy that they can do at home. The reason that this has become so successful is they decided to target the employers who are helping, cover the health insurance costs of their employees, and specifically around employers who have a lot of employees who might have repetitive musculoskeletal injury. So what they did so well, and which has now become a template for others, is really target a niche in the market. They didn't try to change all of physical therapy. They just said, we want to find those folks who fit really well into this model. We want to hopefully stop them from getting excessive surgeries. We want to see if we can treat them early and do some preventative care. And it's been hugely profitable to them. They've been a unicorn in that space, which means that their fundraising has been enormous. So that's an example of someone who came in with an outside of the box perspective. They targeted their niche successfully, and then they really did a great job of dominating that segment. And by the way, I've never worked with them, so they are not a Simbex client or anything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Angela. I'll ask a question. Thank you. Hi, thank you for your presentation. Really great. And I really appreciate how you have so many really clear frameworks that I think really clarify some of the decisions that startups are faced with when commercializing products. And as you may remember, we have a body weight support device and we're early stage. So I definitely, some of the charts speak to me, and the idea of having balance is all very important. One thing that we constantly struggle with is, the idea of if we dedicate funding to certain areas, like bringing in experts from the outside, we believe we can accelerate certain areas. But having limited resources, you have to make that decision carefully, of course, because you can't dedicate resources to everything. There's the technical side, and trying to help that iterative process of product development. And then there's the other side of talking with all the experts in the various areas, regulatory or reimbursement, all of these areas that are going to inform your decision about eventual commercialization. Do you have any advice, sort of general advice around the most important areas that you would suggest your startups with limited resources, where they really dedicate key resources early on and really choose to invest in certain areas to help accelerate or make their path better?
Yeah, a couple of things. So you're right. It's such a catch-22 because the pot is not endless, right, of the resources. I will say that one of the things when we're talking about resources is there is both time and money. And thankfully, some of the things that cost more money don't take as much time, and some of the things that take more time don't cost as much money. So you can think about allocating those, in different ways. It's very hard to get away from the money on the technical side, that it just physically costs money to build things. So what you can do there is pause between cycles. So, an intensive development period, and then a pause in order to make sure that you're caught up with your other aspects on the business, the clinical side, and the feedback side. I will say that it's a lot easier to get kind of free advice on the business side of things because it's just a wider field. There are folks out there who have been serial entrepreneurs who would very, very happily take an hour or two of their well-qualified time to go through your business model, or point you in the right direction for your finances. So you can do a lot of that yourself with the advice of someone looking over your shoulder and not having to pay for their actual time to do every single thing. And then on the clinical side, time is so precious to clinicians. So you need to have your game plan really down and be able to talk to them for 5 minutes at a time. And you may have to compensate them for, whatever patient time that they're missing during that section. So just looking at those 3 areas and knowing what the balance of time and money is in those areas can really help you target your perspective. I would say I think I mentioned this, but one of the mistakes that people make is thinking that they have to have a super functional advanced prototype before they go out and talk to people about it. And you can get a long ways with like a paper prototype that's maybe just a diagram of what you're thinking about doing. So if you have to skimp on something, I would think about skimping on the functional development and spending more time on the ideation side of things.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're just about at time. So if there's no more questions, I think we'll wrap up there if that's okay.
Thank you, Angela. I agree with you. And thank you for sharing your contact information. If anybody has any questions, they'll be able to contact you there. Again, thank you, Angela, for sharing your expertise and such an informative presentation. I really appreciate you spending this time with us. Thank you, everyone, for joining in and listening. If you are not a member of Technology Networking Group and would like to be one, please, I have posted the link in chat, so you can use that. The recording for this presentation will be available in about 24 to 48 hours on the same link. There's a page for TechTalks, and this link will be available there. I hope to see you all again in November at the ACRM annual conference in Chicago. And we will not have another Tech Talk in the meantime till before November. So I hope to see you all at the conference. Again, thank you, Angela. And
thank you for having me.
everyone have a great day.